My Uncle Marcus threw my $25,000 architecture fellowship into the fireplace. I watched the thick cream paper land directly on the burning logs, the edges curling brown before catching a bright, sudden flame. "No niece of mine needs Boston," Marcus said, wiping invisible soot from his hands. "You will be a maid in this house for the rest of your life." My grandmother, Estelle, sat perfectly still at the head of the long dining table. She did not gasp. She did not argue. She waited exactly 30 seconds, letting the silence press against the walls. Then she stood up, smoothed the front of her cardigan, looked directly at Marcus, and said, "Pack her bags." Before I tell you exactly what happened the night that empire crumbled, please drop your location and local time in the comments. I would love to know where you are listening from. The ash settled quietly. I was 18 years old. That envelope in the fireplace held 9 months of secret portfolio building. It held late nights, sketching under a heavy quilt with a dying flashlight, and it held the only ticket out of the life Marcus had built for me. As the paper turned to grey flakes and drifted up the chimney, Marcus watched my face. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to drop to my knees on the antique Persian rug and beg for his mercy. Or cry until I couldn't breathe. That was his currency. Marcus fed on the emotional collapse of the people around him. It validated his power. But I did not give him a single tear. I just watched the fire. The dining room was dead quiet, save for the crackle of the burning wood and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I could feel my 12-year-old sister, Rosie, trembling slightly in the chair next to mine. I reached under the heavy oak table and squeezed her knee, a silent promise that I was not breaking. Crying in front of Marcus meant losing. The moment you showed him your pain, he weaponized it. I had learned that lesson years ago. So, I pushed the grief down into a small dark box inside my chest and locked it. I kept my breathing steady. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. Silence is not the same thing as surrender. People often confuse the two. When you are trapped in a room with a man who uses volume to control the atmosphere, your quietness becomes a shield he cannot penetrate. He expected a hysterical teenager whose dreams had just been crushed. Instead, he got a stone wall. I looked away from the fireplace and met his eyes. He shifted his weight, slightly unnerved by the absolute lack of drama. He had burned my future, but he had not burned me. I was already calculating how to recover the lost documents, who to call at the admissions office, and how to shield Rosie from the fallout of the coming days. I did not need his permission to build a life. I started doing the math. Let me paint a picture of the prison we lived in. From the outside, the property was breathtaking. It was a historic bed and breakfast in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, valued at over $1,800,000. It had 3 stories of pristine white brick, deep wraparound porches, and ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Tourists paid a premium to stay there. They saw the polished mahogany banisters, the crystal chandeliers, and the fresh hydrangeas in the foyer. They saw Marcus, playing the role of the charming southern host, wearing crisp linen shirts and offering recommendations for dinner down by the Battery. But a house has 2 faces, and Rosie and I only knew the second one. While the guests slept in canopy beds on the 1st and 2nd floors, my sister and I shared a cramped, windowless room in the sweltering attic space behind the kitchen. It smelled of old dust and bleach. The air conditioning rarely reached us in the summer, and the heating never quite made it up the pipes in the winter. Our lives operated on a strict military schedule dictated by Marcus. My alarm went off at 4:30 every morning. By 5, I was in the industrial kitchen prepping the breakfast service. I baked the scones, arranged the fruit platters, and brewed the expensive coffee Marcus boasted about in the brochures. By 7, I was out of sight, moving like a ghost through the hallways to collect the laundry. I stripped beds, scrubbed porcelain tubs until my knuckles bled, and carried hampers that weighed half as much as I did up and down 3 flights of stairs. I was not treated like a niece. I was an unpaid employee with no days off. Marcus obsessed over the property's image. The silver had to be polished every Tuesday. The front steps had to be swept twice a day. If a guest complained about a smudge on a water glass, Marcus would wait until the guests were out for the evening, pull me into the kitchen, and deliver a low, vicious lecture about how useless I was. He never raised his voice loud enough for the paying customers to hear. He was careful about that. The cruelty was always contained, always behind closed doors. To the outside world, he was a saint who had taken in his orphaned nieces. To us, he was a warden. The illusion was perfectly maintained. The only sanctuary I had in that massive house was my grandmother Estelle's study on the 3rd floor. Estelle was in her late 70s, a quiet, observant woman who spent most of her days reading by the window or managing the estate's extensive paperwork. Marcus largely ignored her, treating her as a frail relic he had to tolerate to maintain his image as a devoted son. He assumed she was oblivious. He was very wrong. Every Wednesday morning, it was my job to dust Estelle's study. It was a task I actually enjoyed because it meant 30 minutes of peace. One morning in late autumn, while wiping down her heavy walnut desk, I noticed a pattern. The mailman usually dropped the letters in the brass slot at the front door around 10. Marcus always sorted it, keeping the bills and the guest bookings for himself and handing Estelle her catalogues. But at exactly 8:30, before the regular mail arrived, a private courier would occasionally knock on the side door near the kitchen. I was usually scrubbing pots at that hour. The courier always handed me a thick, sealed envelope made of heavy, expensive paper. It was always addressed directly to Estelle. The return address was always the same. Walter and Associates, a prominent law firm downtown. The first time I handed one to my grandmother, I expected her to open it casually. Instead, she took it from my hands, her eyes sharp and clear, and immediately placed it into a small steel lockbox hidden inside her bottom drawer. She turned the key, slipped the key into her pocket, and looked up at me. And, "Thank you, Harper," she had said, her voice completely even. "We do not need to mention this to your uncle. He worries about legal jargon." It was a quiet directive. I nodded. Over the next few months, I delivered 6 more of those thick envelopes to her. I never asked what was inside them. I just knew that the frail woman Marcus thought he was managing was conducting serious, systematic business right under his nose. Estelle was building something, and I could feel it in the deliberate way she moved, in the way she watched Marcus strut around the dining room, talking about his accomplishments. She was letting him talk, letting him believe he held the reins. Marcus saw absolutely nothing coming. To understand why I allowed myself to be treated like a servant in my own family's home, you have to understand the price of pity. 5 years before that night in the dining room, my parents died in a pile-up on the interstate. I was 13, Rosie was 7. One day we were fighting over television channels in our modest suburban living room, and the next, we were standing in black dresses at a cemetery, holding hands while strangers offered us casseroles and empty condolences. Marcus stepped in immediately. He was my father's older brother, a man who had always viewed my dad with a quiet, simmering resentment. Marcus had never married. He lived in the Grand Charleston property with Estelle and managed the business. When the social workers got involved, Marcus painted himself as the ultimate saviour. "They are blood," he had declared loudly at the funeral reception, making sure the neighbours heard him. "I will not let them go to the state. They will come live with me and my mother. I will provide for them." It sounded noble. It sounded like a rescue. But the rescue was a transaction. Within 2 weeks of moving into the B&B, the dynamic shifted. The grief counselling Marcus promised never materialised. The new school uniforms were delayed. Instead, he handed me a bottle of industrial glass cleaner and pointed to the sunroom windows. You need to earn your keep, Harper," he had said, his tone shifting from uncle to manager. "Food and board in a place like this isn't free. Your father didn't leave you a fortune. I am carrying the burden now." He used the word burden constantly. It became the background noise of our childhood. Every meal we ate, every pair of shoes he bought for Rosie was logged in an invisible ledger he kept in his mind. He made sure we knew exactly how much we were costing him. He didn't hit us. He didn't lock us in the basement. He did something much more effective. He completely dismantled our sense of worth and replaced it with a crushing, inescapable debt. He isolated us from our old friends, claiming we were too busy with our new responsibilities. Charity became a life sentence. People who have never been trapped in a system of emotional abuse often ask the same question. Why didn't you just leave? You were a teenager. You could have walked out the door. But leaving requires resources. It requires a place to go, money to eat, and a belief that you are capable of surviving on the outside. Marcus had systematically stripped all three of those things away from me. This is the invisible chain of the indebted child. It is a form of psychological conditioning. Gaslighting isn't just about making someone doubt their memory. It is about making them doubt their fundamental ability to exist without their abuser. Marcus curated my reality. He monitored the family computer. He refused to sign the paperwork allowing me to get a part-time job at a local cafe, claiming my duties at the B&B were my priority. Without a job, I had no money. Without money, I had no mobility. If I ran away alone, I would be a minor on the streets of Charleston. The police would bring me right back to his front door, and his retaliation would be swift and silent. But the real anchor, the thing that kept me scrubbing those floors day after day, was Rosie. I could not leave a 7-year-old girl behind in that house. Marcus knew that. He used her as collateral. If I ever pushed back against a demand, if I ever showed exhaustion, Marcus would simply sigh and look at my little sister. "Well, if Harper is too tired to finish the laundry," he would say smoothly, "I suppose Rosie will have to learn how to use the industrial bleach." That was all it took. I would swallow the anger, pick up the basket, and go back to the basement. I absorbed his cruelty so she wouldn't have to. I became a human shield. I told myself that I just needed to survive until I turned 18, until I could legally sign a lease and pull her out of there through the proper channels. I was not staying out of loyalty to him. I was staying out of necessity. I was biding my time, saving every quarter I found in the sofa cushions, hiding them in a mason jar behind the loose brick in our closet. I was waiting for Rosie. The breaking point did not arrive with a loud argument. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, quietly, in the form of red, peeling skin on my 12-year-old sister's knees. Marcus had decided that morning that the master suite on the second floor needed a deep, restorative cleaning before a wealthy couple arrived for the weekend. Normally, this was my task, but I was already in the kitchen, preparing 50 miniature quiches for a garden luncheon. So, Marcus turned his attention to Rosie. "She eats 3 meals a day here," Marcus had said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. "It is time she learns the value of the roof over her head. Give her the scrub brush." I watched my little sister carry a heavy plastic bucket of industrial bleach and water up the grand staircase. 2 hours later, I found her in the master bathroom. She was kneeling on the cold marble floor, scrubbing the grout with a toothbrush. Her hands were raw, and the harsh chemicals had burned the skin on her knees through her thin cotton leggings. She was crying silently, terrified that Marcus would hear her. I took the brush from her hand. I washed her knees with warm water. I did not say a word to Marcus, but in that bathroom, the invisible chain he had wrapped around my neck finally snapped. I realised that my endurance was not protecting her. It was merely delaying her induction into his labour camp. I had to get us out. The escape required a vehicle, and mine was going to be architecture. I had always loved buildings, a quiet inheritance from my father, who used to draft small house plans on Sunday mornings. I started drawing on the back of discarded reservation receipts, sketching the historic cornices and arches of the Charleston properties I saw through the windows. My silent rebellion found an unexpected ally in room 4.
Mr. Harrison was a retired structural engineer from Philadelphia who rented a room at the bed and breakfast for 3 months every winter. He was a quiet man with silver hair and sharp eyes. He noticed things. He noticed that I was the one carrying his heavy suitcases, and he noticed the graphite smudges on my apron.
One morning, while I was clearing his breakfast tray, he casually left a thick pad of professional drafting paper and a set of high-grade architectural pencils on the edge of the table. I bought the wrong weight. "Mr. Harrison said, not looking up from his newspaper. "Throw them away for me, would you, Harper, or find some use for them? It is a shame to waste good supplies." I took the paper. That night, after Marcus locked the downstairs doors and the house went dark, I sat on the floor of our sweltering attic room with a flashlight clamp between my teeth. I began to draw properly. "Mr. Harrison started leaving old textbooks on his desk with sticky notes marking chapters on structural integrity and historical restoration. He was teaching me without ever speaking a word of instruction. The lines became my escape. By November, I had compiled a portfolio robust enough to apply for a prestigious, fully funded architecture fellowship in Boston. The program offered full tuition, housing, and a monthly stipend. It was exactly $25,000 a year in value. More importantly, it offered family housing options for independent students with dependents. It was a golden ticket for Rosie and me. I mailed the application in secret, walking 3 miles in the freezing rain to the downtown post office, so Marcus would not see the outgoing envelope in the hall tray. Then, the waiting began. I anticipated a response by early March, but in February, I discovered something that chilled my blood. Every Thursday, Marcus took a 3-hour lunch at his private club. It was my designated time to clean his ground floor office. I was wiping down the heavy mahogany desk when my dustcloth caught the edge of his top drawer, pulling it open just an inch. I reached to push it shut, but a flash of cream-coloured paper caught my eye. It was an envelope with a familiar seal. My heart did a slow, heavy roll against my ribs. I pulled the drawer open completely. Inside, sitting underneath a stack of utility bills, was an admissions packet from a state university I had applied to as a backup option months ago. The envelope had been sliced open. I carefully pulled the letter out. It was a formal acceptance letter, offering a partial scholarship. The date on the header was from 3 weeks ago. Marcus had intercepted it. He had recognised the university seal, opened my mail, read my acceptance, and buried it in his desk. He never said a word. He just sat at the dinner table every night, asking me to pass the salt, knowing he was actively suffocating my future while I served him food. It is one thing to know your abuser is a harsh taskmaster. It is entirely another to see the physical proof that he is meticulously and quietly sabotaging your escape routes. He was not just using me for free labour. He was ensuring I would never be qualified for anything else. I held the letter in my hands. The instinct to storm into the dining room, to scream, to demand answers, flared in my chest. But I crushed it instantly. Confronting him would only tip my hand. It would teach him to hide the mail better. It would give him the opportunity to punish Rosie. I folded the letter exactly as I had found it. I placed it back under the utility bills. I closed the heavy mahogany drawer. I finished dusting the room, making sure every surface gleamed. I needed to be smarter. I needed to make sure the Boston Fellowship letter never landed in his hands, or I would be trapped in this house forever. He was building a wall. The discovery in the drawer forced me to look for immediate alternatives. If the Boston Fellowship rejected me, or if Marcus found a way to intercept that letter too. I needed a backup plan for Rosie and myself. I decided to reach out to the only family we had left on my mother's side. Aunt Martha lived in Ohio. She was my mother's older sister, a woman who used to send us hand-knitted sweaters when we were toddlers. After the funeral, Marcus had taken over all communication. He told me Aunt Martha was too devastated to speak to us, and over the years, the distance had solidified into complete silence. One afternoon, while Marcus was out negotiating with a local linen supplier, I slipped into his office and used the landline. I dialed the Ohio number from memory, my palms sweating against the plastic receiver. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. "Aunt Martha," I said, keeping my voice low. "It is Harper." There was a long pause on the other end, no gasp of delight, no warmth, just a heavy, uncomfortable silence. "Harper," she finally said. Her tone was tight, guarded. "Are you all right? Has something happened to Marcus?" "Marcus is fine," I said quickly. "I'm calling because Rosie and I need help. We need a place to stay. Just for a few months, until I turn 18 and can secure my own apartment. Things here are not what they seem." Another pause. When Aunt Martha spoke again, the chill in her voice was absolute. "Marcus warned me you might do this," she said with a heavy sigh. I froze. "Warned you?" "He called me last month. He told me you have been acting out, stealing money from the guest registers, lying. He said the grief finally caught up with you and you are trying to tear the family apart to get attention." I closed my eyes. The room spun slightly. Marcus had not just isolated us physically. He had conducted a masterclass in character assassination across state lines. He knew I might eventually try to run. So he burned every bridge I had before I even reached it. "Aunt Martha, please," I whispered, fighting the tremor in my voice. "None of that is true. He makes Rosie scrub floors with industrial bleach. He took my college letters. He treats us like servants." "Harper, stop it," she snapped. "Your uncle is a good man. He took you in when you had nothing. He pays for your food, your clothes. It is shameful how ungrateful you are being. I will not listen to you slander him." She did not wait for my reply. The line went dead. I stood in the quiet office, listening to the dial tone. He had engineered a perfect cage. If I spoke the truth, I was a liar. If I asked for help, I was ungrateful. The outside world looked at Marcus and saw a saint. I placed the receiver back on the cradle. I wiped down the phone so he would not find my fingerprints. I was completely on my own. The Boston Fellowship letter arrived on a Saturday in late March. I had learned my lesson. I started waking up at 5 in the morning to wait by the street corner for the postal worker, intercepting the mail before it ever reached the brass slot on our front door. When the thick, cream-coloured envelope with the Massachusetts postmark was finally handed to me, my hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it. I opened it in the alleyway behind the kitchen. I was accepted, full tuition, housing allowance, a stipend. Everything we needed to survive. I naively believed that the sheer undeniable math of the fellowship would force Marcus to concede. I thought that if I could prove I required 0 financial support from him, he would have no excuse to keep me. I spent the entire weekend preparing my presentation. I even brought down the small balsa wood architectural model I had built with Mr. Harrison's scrap materials, placing it in a neat cardboard box. Sunday dinner was at 6 o'clock sharp. The dining room was set with the good silver. Marcus sat at the head, carving a roast. Estelle sat at the opposite end. Rosie and I sat across from each other. I waited until the plates were cleared. My heart was a steady drum in my chest. I reached under my chair, pulled out the cream envelope, and set it on the polished oak table. Next to it, I placed the small balsa wood model of a restored cathedral dome. "I have been accepted to a fellowship in Boston," I said. My voice did not shake. "It covers everything. I will be leaving in August, and I am taking Rosie with me." Marcus stopped wiping his mouth. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the delicate wooden model. He did not look at me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Marcus smiled. It was a cold, empty stretching of his lips. He reached across the table and picked up my architectural model. He held it up to the light, inspecting the intricate beams I had spent 50 hours carving. "Boston," he said softly. His hand closed into a fist. The balsa wood snapped with a sharp, sickening crack. He crushed the model into splinters, letting the broken pieces fall onto his empty dinner plate. Rosie let out a tiny, stifled gasp. "Architecture," Marcus sneered, his voice dropping into that low, vicious register. "Your father had the same stupid delusions. He thought he could build things too. And he drove himself and your mother straight into a concrete barrier." He picked up the cream envelope. He did not even bother to open it. He walked over to the fireplace behind his chair, where a warm fire was crackling. "No niece of mine needs Boston," he said. He tossed the envelope directly into the flames. "You will be a maid in this house for the rest of your life." I watched the fire consume my future. I did not cry. I did not move. The fire consumed it all. The silence following the destruction of my letter was absolute. Marcus stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He wanted the tears. He wanted the screaming match so he could justify locking me in the attic for a week. But I remained seated, my hands folded over my lap, staring at the ash. It was my grandmother, Estelle, who finally broke the stillness. She had been sitting at the end of the table, a silent observer to the cruelty, her face as unreadable as carved marble. She slowly unclasped her hands, placed her linen napkin perfectly beside her plate, and stood up. She did not look at the fireplace. She looked directly at Marcus. "Pack her bags," Estelle said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the crystal glasses on the table vibrate slightly. It was a tone of absolute, non-negotiable authority. Marcus let out a short barking laugh. It was a sound of pure disbelief. He spread his arms, gesturing to the opulent room around him. "Pack her bags," Marcus echoed, grinning. "And send her where, Mother? She has not got a dime to her name. Are you going to throw a teenager and a 12-year-old onto the streets of Charleston? Be my guest." Estelle did not engage with his mocking. She turned her gaze to me. "Harper, go upstairs to your room. Pack everything you and Rosie own. Bring it to the 3rd floor. You are moving into the guest suite next to my study. Tonight." Marcus's smile vanished. The 3rd floor was Estelle's private sanctuary. It had a heavy oak door at the base of the stairs that locked from the inside. Even Marcus did not cross that threshold without an invitation. "They are not going anywhere," Marcus snapped, stepping forward. "This is my house. I run this property. They are my responsibility." "You run the bookings." "Marcus," Estelle said coldly, "do not confuse doing the laundry with owning the washing machine." She turned and walked out of the dining room. I stood up immediately. I grabbed Rosie's hand, and we walked past Marcus, ignoring the furious red flush creeping up his neck. We packed our meagre belongings in less than 15 minutes. When we carried our bags up the stairs, Estelle was waiting. She ushered us inside the beautiful, spacious suite and locked the heavy door behind us. The click of the deadbolt was the loudest sound I had heard in 5 years. The next morning, while Marcus was busy downstairs managing the breakfast service, I sat at the antique desk in Estelle's study. I picked up her private telephone line. I dialed the admissions office at the Boston Fellowship Program. I kept my voice completely steady. I explained that my acceptance letter had been destroyed in a domestic dispute. I asked for an electronic copy to be sent to an email address I had just created, and I requested the formal enrollment paperwork. The admissions officer listened quietly, verified my identity, and agreed. The dial tone finally stopped. The third floor of the house was incredibly quiet. It lacked the constant, vibrating hum of the industrial refrigerators and the endless foot traffic of the lower levels. After I managed to get Rosie settled into the heavy, four-poster guest bed, I walked down the hall into the study. Estelle was sitting at her walnut desk. Only a small brass reading lamp was switched on, casting a warm, concentrated glow over a massive stack of documents. She had finally opened the steel lockbox from her bottom drawer. She gestured for me to pull up a chair. For the first time, she showed me the exact contents of the heavy envelopes I had been carrying up the back stairs for months. They were comprehensive banking records. I saw detailed monthly ledgers from the bed and breakfast primary operational accounts, positioned right alongside statements from a separate high-yield historical maintenance fund. My grandmother had been meticulously tracking every single dollar that entered and exited the property. She picked up a heavy red fountain pen. With agonizing precision, she drew a sharp line under a withdrawal for $4,000. Then she circled another for $6,000. Your uncle believes I do not understand modern banking, Estelle said, her voice perfectly level in the quiet room. He thinks because I prefer paper, I am blind to the digital theft. She proceeded to explain the hidden reality of the last 5 years. Marcus had been slowly, systematically bleeding the estate's maintenance fund dry. The money specifically designated to repair the historic slate roof and update the aging plumbing was instead covering his private social club memberships, disastrous stock market bets, and a mounting pile of quiet gambling debts. He was utterly desperate to maintain the public illusion of being a wealthy, successful Southern gentleman, and he was actively funding that fragile illusion with stolen money. I sat there, staring blankly at the columns of numbers. My mind immediately flashed back to the countless mornings he had aggressively berated me for using too much liquid laundry detergent, claiming we were running an incredibly tight budget. He had squeezed the very life out of Rosie and me to save mere pennies, all while he was quietly siphoning tens of thousands of dollars behind a locked office door. Estelle had watched it all happen from the head of the dining table. She had let him dig his own grave, month after month, documenting every single stolen cent to build an absolutely airtight case against him. She knew that if she confronted him early, he would simply hide the money better or manipulate the accounts. She needed undeniable, overwhelming proof. I could not protect you from the chores, Harper, she whispered, placing her hand over mine. If I had fought him on the small things, he would have realized I was watching the big things. I had to wait until the trap was perfectly set. I looked down at the banking statements. The sheer patience of a woman in her 70s, gathering evidence for years without ever once changing her facial expression, was staggering. I ran my fingers over the paper. The red ink bled through. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent endurance. We did not leave the third floor. Estelle arranged for a private grocery delivery, which the courier brought directly up the back fire escape stairs, while Marcus paced the lower levels, furious that his unpaid staff had vanished. I sat at Estelle's antique desk with my laptop. I had completely bypassed the physical mail system. I was constantly refreshing my newly created email inbox, waiting for the admissions office in Boston to process my urgent request. The anxiety was a physical weight on my chest. I knew Marcus was likely downstairs, standing by the front door, waiting to intercept any secondary mail from Massachusetts. He thought he still controlled the flow of information. He fundamentally misunderstood how the modern world operated. At exactly 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, a notification chimed through the laptop speakers. I clicked the bold text. It was an official communication from the university's fellowship committee. Attached was a secure digital document containing my formal acceptance and the financial aid breakdown. I read the terms slowly, making sure I understood every single word. The fellowship provided $25,000 a year. It included comprehensive family housing options, a generous monthly living stipend, and full tuition coverage. Furthermore, because I had explained my precarious domestic situation, the financial aid officer had expedited a dependency override. This meant the university would not require any tax information or legal signatures from Marcus. I was completely legally independent. I read the digital letter 3 times. There was no paper for Marcus to steal. There was no envelope for him to burn in the dining room fireplace. This acceptance existed on a secure server, completely untouchable by his hands. For 5 long years, my entire sense of self-worth had been tied to how quickly I could scrub a porcelain bathtub or fold a fitted sheet. Marcus had convinced me that without his charitable roof, Rosie and I would be destitute. Looking at the digital signature of the university dean, that illusion completely shattered. I did not need his roof. I had earned my own. I quietly closed the laptop screen. I walked into the adjoining guest bedroom where Rosie was sitting on the rug, reading a paperback novel in the afternoon sunlight. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and cautious, still expecting the heavy footsteps of our uncle to echo up the stairwell at any moment. "We are going to Boston," I told her, keeping my voice soft but incredibly firm. "You are never going to touch industrial bleach again. We are done." Rosie simply nodded, leaning her head against my knee. The suffocating air of the Charleston house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a prison holding us captive. It was just a temporary waiting room before our actual life began. The future belonged to me. Marcus did not handle the loss of his control with any shred of dignity. By Wednesday evening, his simmering frustration boiled over into outright aggression. He had been forced to hire a last-minute, expensive cleaning crew to turn over the guest rooms, and the financial hit was clearly enraging him. At 7 o'clock, heavy. Thudding footsteps echoed up the wooden stairwell. He pounded his fist against the solid oak door separating the 3rd floor from the rest of the house. "Open this door! Mother!" Marcus shouted. His voice was thick with entitlement. "You cannot hide them up there forever. We have paying guests arriving tomorrow, and the silver has not been polished." Estelle did not move from her reading chair. She simply turned a page in her novel. "A Harper," Marcus yelled, his tone dropping into the vicious register he usually reserved for the kitchen. "If you do not come down here right now and do your job, I'm going to pack everything you own in garbage bags and throw it onto the street. You have nowhere else to go. You owe me for 5 years of food and shelter." I sat on the edge of the sofa, listening to his threats. A few days ago, those words would have sent me spiralling into a deep panic. Now, they just sounded pathetic. Suddenly, a white piece of paper slid underneath the gap at the bottom of the oak door. I walked over and picked it up. It was a handwritten document, drafted hastily on the bed and breakfast's official letterhead. It was a mock contract. Marcus had actually taken the time to write out a list of demands. The document stated that in exchange for his continued generosity and guardianship, I would agree to work 40 hours a week without pay for the next 5 years. It included a clause stating I would abandon any foolish ideas of moving to Massachusetts. He wanted me to sign away my early 20s to maintain his profit margins. It was the ultimate evidence of his absolute delusion. He honestly believed he held all the cards. He thought his charity was a binding legal trap. And he was entirely confident that the fear he had instilled in me since I was 13 years old would override my desire for freedom. He wanted my signature as a final submission. I held the ridiculous contract in my hand. I looked at the sloppy handwriting, the aggressive underlining of the word loyalty. I did not feel angry. I just felt a profound sense of clarity. He was a small-shaded, greedy man trying to build an empire on the backs of orphaned children. I let the paper fall to the floor. He was talking to a wall. The pounding on the door continued for another 10 minutes. Marcus was completely unraveling. He was not used to being ignored. In his carefully curated world, his voice was the ultimate authority. I walked over to the oak door, picked up his handwritten contract from the floor, and folded it neatly in half. I did not say a word. I did not yell back. I just waited. Estelle carefully placed a silver bookmark in her novel, set the book on her side table, and stood up. She smoothed the front of her wool cardigan and walked deliberately toward the door. She reached out and unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. She turned the handle and pulled the door open. Marcus was standing on the top step. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He had his fist raised, ready to pound on the wood again. When he saw his mother standing there, perfectly calm, he dropped his hand. "Finally?" Marcus snapped, trying to regain his dominant posture. "Tell her to get her uniform on. The dining room needs to be prepped for the morning." Estelle simply looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She did not match his frantic energy. "You are making a terrible amount of noise in my house. Marcus," she said quietly. "Your house." Marcus scoffed, stepping forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. "I run this business. I pay the utility bills. I put the food on the table. Without my management, this place would have crumbled a decade ago. These girls are my wards, and they will follow my rules." I stood right behind my grandmother. I looked directly into my uncle's eyes. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. I just handed the folded contract back to him. He snatched it from my hand, expecting me to speak. I gave him absolutely nothing. "Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you have ever had to stand in complete silence while a toxic person desperately tried to tear you down to maintain their own power, tell me how you survived that moment in the comments." I read every single one of them. The physical contrast in the hallway was striking. Marcus was sweating, breathing heavily, entirely consumed by his own fabricated rage. Estelle and I were completely still. We were a fortress he could not breach. His shouting bounced off us and echoed uselessly down the stairwell. He realized, in that split second, that the fear he had relied on for 5 years was entirely gone. His voice began to break. Marcus tried to push past us into the third-floor suite, but Estelle held her ground. She reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan and pulled out one of the thick, cream-coloured envelopes from Walter and Associates. It was the same envelope I had delivered to her multiple times over the years. "You seem incredibly confused about the nature of your living arrangements," Estelle said, her tone clinical and detached. She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of legal documents bound with a thick blue backing. She unfolded the papers and held them up so Marcus could clearly see the embossed seal of the state of South Carolina at the top. "This is an irrevocable trust," Estelle explained slowly, the way a teacher speaks to a student who is struggling to comprehend a basic fact. "Your father, Arthur, established this trust exactly 22 years ago. He transferred the entire deed of this property, the business licenses, and the surrounding land directly into it." Marcus stared at the documents. The angry flush on his cheeks began to fade into a sickly, pale white. "I am the sole trustee," Estelle continued, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet stairwell. "I have absolute, unmitigated control over this estate. The trust cannot be altered. It cannot be contested by you, and it certainly does not recognise you as an owner. You own exactly 0% of this historic property. It is important to understand the absolute power of this specific legal structure. An irrevocable trust removes the asset completely from the grantor's taxable estate and protects it from creditors. But more importantly, it meant that Marcus's entire identity as the wealthy master of the house was a complete legal fiction. He was not an owner. He was not even a partner. In the eyes of the law, Marcus was nothing more than a tenant at will, a guest who was permitted to stay solely by the grace of the trustee. But I have put my sweat into this building, Marcus stammered, his confident posture collapsing inward. I manage the bookings. I am the eldest son. You were a property manager who compensated himself by living rent-free in $1 million mansion, Estelle corrected him sharply. And you abused the children placed under your care. You thought your gender and your loud voice made you the king here. She tapped the heavy legal paper with her index finger. This paper says otherwise. Marcus looked at the trust document, then looked at me. The realization that he had been loudly issuing orders inside a kingdom he never actually owned hit him like a physical blow. He had built his entire ego on a foundation of sand, and my grandmother had just quietly summoned the tide. The castle was never his. Marcus stared at the thick blue backing of the legal document. His eyes darted from the embossed state seal to the clear, precise signature of my late grandfather at the bottom of the page. You could physically see the reality of his situation settling over him, an invisible weight pressing down on his broad shoulders. The arrogant posture he had maintained for 5 years began to fold inward. This is completely absurd, Marcus stammered, though his voice had lost its booming resonance. He looked from the paper to my grandmother, a nervous, erratic energy taking over his hands. I have maintained this property. I managed the staff. I handled the bookings, the marketing, the repairs. You cannot simply erase my sweat equity with a piece of 22-year-old paper. A judge would laugh you out of the courtroom. He was grasping at straws, trying to use the vocabulary of business to mask his absolute panic. He thought throwing around terms like sweat equity would intimidate an elderly woman. Estelle did not blink. She stood in the doorway of the third-floor suite, projecting an aura of complete, unshakable calm. You managed a property you did not own, Estelle replied, her tone conversational but sharp as glass. And you lived rent-free in $1 million historic mansion while doing so. Any court would consider that a more than generous compensation package for your services. You have absolutely no claim to this estate, Marcus. None. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words seemed to die in his throat. The foundation of his identity, the wealthy, aristocratic southern host, had just been evaporated. He looked at me, standing quietly behind Estelle, and the hatred in his eyes was palpable. He realised I was not going back to the kitchen. The free labour was officially gone. I am giving you a very simple choice, Estelle continued, cutting through his silent rage. Harper has been accepted to a fellowship in Boston. You will allow her to leave. You will sign whatever guardian waivers are required to facilitate her transition. You will not interfere with her or Rosie in any capacity. If you do this quietly, I will allow you to maintain your current living arrangement on the first floor for the time being. She tilted her head slightly, letting the silence hang before delivering the alternative. If you refuse, or if you attempt to retaliate against these girls in any way, I will execute my authority as the sole trustee. I will serve you with a 30-day notice of eviction tomorrow morning, and I will have the local sheriff remove your belongings from the premises. Choose. Marcus looked at the legal document in her hand. He looked at the locked door of the study behind us. He realised, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he possessed absolutely no leverage. He was a tenant facing the actual owner. He turned around without saying a single word. He walked heavily down the carpeted stairs, his footsteps slow and defeated. The choice was his. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house felt remarkably different. Marcus was avoiding the third floor entirely. We had breakfast in Estelle's private sitting room. After we ate, Estelle asked Rosie to stay and read her books. She turned to me, her expression softening into something incredibly vulnerable. She asked me to get my coat. We had an appointment. We walked 3 blocks down the historic cobblestone streets of Charleston until we reached a polished mahogany door bearing the brass nameplate of Walter and Associates. The receptionist smiled warmly at Estelle and ushered us immediately into a massive corner office. The room smelled of old leather volumes and fresh chamomile tea. Mr. Walter was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and a meticulously tailored suit. He greeted my grandmother like an old friend. Once we were seated, Estelle looked at me. She reached across the low mahogany table and took my hand. "I need to apologise to you." "Harper," she said, her voice carrying a quiet tremor I had never heard before. "I know you spent the last 5 years wondering why I sat at that dining table and watched him treat you like a servant. I know you thought I was either blind or a coward." I swallowed hard, looking down at my lap. I had never dared to say those words out loud, but they had lived in my mind for years. "I was neither," Estelle continued gently. "When your parents passed, Marcus took control of the daily finances before I could stop him. Within months, I noticed irregularities, small amounts at first, but then he started accessing the historic maintenance fund. He is a terrible gambler, Harper. He has been pouring thousands of dollars into private card games and disastrous offshore investments to maintain his image." "Mr." Walter opened a thick file on his desk. He turned the folder so I could see the highlighted bank statements. "If I had evicted him 5 years ago," Estelle explained, her grip tightening on my hand, "he would have taken you and Rosie with him. He had legal custody, and without concrete proof of severe abuse or gross negligence, the courts would have sided with the biological uncle. I could not risk him taking you away from this house, away from my protection." She pointed to the stack of bank statements. "So I let him steal. I documented every single illegal transfer. I waited until the amount of money he embezzled crossed the threshold of a major felony. I needed enough criminal evidence to ensure that when I finally dropped the cage, he would go to federal prison if he ever tried to fight me for custody of you and Rosie. I was not ignoring your pain. I was building a weapon." I stared at my grandmother. The profound depth of her patience, her willingness to play the silent fool for half a decade to guarantee our permanent safety, was overwhelming. If you have ever had to play the long game, swallowing your pride for years just to outsmart a toxic person, let me know in the comments. We were finally ready. Marcus did not choose the peaceful route. 10 days before his eviction deadline, after a furious but futile social media campaign, painting himself as a martyred guardian, he demanded formal mediation. He and his aggressive attorney, Mr. Weiss, arrived at Mr. Walter's law office radiating smug confidence. Weiss did not waste time. He demanded 50% of the estate's market value, nearly $1 million, claiming implied equity for Marcus's management of the bed and breakfast. He threatened a messy public lawsuit, assuming my grandmother, Estelle, would be terrified into settling. Estelle sat perfectly upright. "Mr. Walter calmly slid a thick black binder across the mahogany table. "Your arguments rely on the premise that your client acted in the estate's best interest." "Mr. Walter said quietly. "Over the past 60 months, he systematically diverted funds to pay off gambling debts. The misappropriated total is $184,300. In South Carolina, this embezzlement is a felony. My client has not filed a police report. Yet." Marcus's confident posture shattered. "Mr. Weiss scanned the verified wire receipts, his strategy disintegrating into dust. An attorney can argue equity. They cannot argue away 5 years of documented felony fraud." Estelle delivered the final blow. "Option 1, you fight this, and you are arrested by tomorrow morning. Option 2, you sign a surrender agreement, vacate by 5 o'clock today, and never contact us again. Stripped of his fabricated authority, Marcus hastily scrawled his name on the voluntary surrender agreement and fled.
Yet, a toxic person rarely relinquishes control without a final, irrational tantrum. Hours later, Marcus filed an emergency injunction for a medical conservatorship, claiming I was coercing my dementia-riddled grandmother into signing away the estate. It was a filthy betrayal designed to freeze her bank accounts and strip her of her human rights.
But Estelle was 10 steps ahead. Weeks prior, she had quietly passed exhaustive cognitive evaluations with top specialists. Mr. Walter immediately filed the notarized medical affidavits proving her brilliant mental acuity, alongside the embezzlement binder. Realizing the profound peril of submitting a fraudulent claim to protect a felon, Mr. Weiss withdrew as counsel. The judge dismissed the petition with extreme prejudice. At 4:30 that afternoon, Marcus left the estate with only 2 suitcases. Blacklisted from Charleston's hospitality industry, he was forced into manual labour to pay rent for a damp apartment. He spent his nights in an unair-conditioned laundry room at a run-down highway motel, ironing heavy linens. He was doing the exact grueling, invisible labour he had forced upon a 13-year-old girl. Exactly 1 year later, the heavy southern humidity faded into the crisp autumn air of Massachusetts. I stood in a sun-drenched architecture studio in Boston, drafting a structural reinforcement plan. My hands, once cracked from harsh bleach, were smooth and stained only by pencil lead. The physical weight of trauma evaporated as I learned to sleep past dawn and read in coffee shops without a crushing wave of guilt. Down south, Estelle had leased the massive estate to a luxury hotel group and bought a cosy residential cottage. When I visited for Thanksgiving, the house smelled of cinnamon and roasted apples. Rosie, now a thriving 13-year-old cellist, was laughing loudly in the kitchen. Even distant relatives who once believed Marcus's lies reached out to apologise, allowing us to slowly rebuild trust. Family was no longer a loaded weapon. It was a house built brick by brick with people who made us feel safe. I keep a photo of my grandmother, Rosie, and me on my drafting desk. Looking back at the nightmare we survived, the greatest lesson I learned was about the true nature of power. Marcus believed power was volume and fear, but his empire was built on a stolen illusion. My grandmother proved that true strength is entirely silent. It is swallowing your pride and meticulously collecting the paper trail necessary to protect those you love. If you are trapped with someone who uses leverage to crush your spirit, remember this: you do not have to match their toxic energy. Gather your resources in the dark, let them underestimate you, and when the time is right, present the paperwork they cannot defeat and walk out the door. The paper always wins.